Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this third livecast session of the international project Climate Citizens Assemblies, Learning with, from and for Europe. It's a 4-month collective learning project around climate citizen assemblies in which we explore the way that citizens can help us to achieve effective, efficient, sustainable and just climate policies, while at the same time strengthening our democracies. This project exists of several elements, so we are building up an online platform. Please check it out. There will be a bit.ly link in screen in a second, so you can look it up. But we're also organizing sessions like the session tonight, so various livecast events in which we bring together European key players all working in this field of climate citizen assemblies, and we bring them together to exchange knowledge, to exchange practices, and to learn and develop this model together. Tonight we will specifically look at the position of these citizen assemblies in our democratic decision-making system. So which mandate do these assemblies actually hold? What political consequences are connected to its outcomes? And how can we prevent that it doesn't end up being a sort of glorified public hearing, but that it can really be an integrated element in the way that we decide and come to solutions for the problems of the 21st century. Such as climate change. So we're going to reflect on these issues with a couple of speakers, both here in the studio and through Zoom. But I also invite you, our audience, from wherever you're watching in Europe or even further away, to join the conversation, share your experience, share your questions, your remarks. Once you send those in, you have to log in on Zoom first on our program page, but once you send them in, they will be sent to me and I will try to incorporate it into the conversation tonight. Also, if you feel like you have a lot more to share than what a simple question or remark can do tonight, please send an email to me, charlie@dezwijger.nl, which will also be mentioned below. If you are working on a climate citizen assembly in your country and you want to connect, please do. We would love to hear from you. All right, so we're going to get down to it immediately. And I think the first step that we have to take is know what we are going to talk about. So why does it actually matter to discuss a mandate, to discuss political follow-up? And I'm going to do that with 3 speakers. 2 of those are sitting next to me. Eva Rovers, my co-initiator of this project, but also the co-founder of Bureau Burgerberaad here in the Netherlands. Eva, welcome back.
Thank you.
And Ellen Maassen, the co-initiator of the G1000 agriculture. Ooh, it's a mouthful, it is. Here also in the Netherlands. Ellen, welcome. Great to have you here. And then through Zoom, Lars Kluver is with us. He's the director of the Danish Board of Technology Foundation. Hi, Lars. Great here. Oh, we cannot hear you yet, but I'm...
Hi.
Yes, there you are. Great. Lovely to have you all here. So Lars and Ellen, you're going to share your practices from the Netherlands and Denmark with us. But I'm going to start with Eva, because like I said, first of all, we need to know why we're actually discussing what we're discussing tonight. And you are this, the partner in crime in this in setting up this entire project. So I give you the honorable task of explaining this to us. So, Eva, we are exploring climate citizen assemblies in Europe. And during this livecast, we're taking specific themes and trying to dig deeper and dive deeper into these issues. Tonight, we're going to do that around mandate and political follow-up. Why is that so important to discuss?
Well, I think climate citizens assemblies can be an incredibly powerful, constructive tool to reach adequate climate policy. We've seen several examples, for instance, in France, where a group of people, the Convention Citoyen, discussed all possible ways to reduce carbon emissions and to have this integral climate policy. And they did some remarkable recommendations. I think the whole process in France was very inspiring, very interesting. I think it inspired a lot of other climate citizens assemblies around Europe. And we were all cheering when the Convention Citoyenne delivered their 149 recommendations to President different languages. President Emmanuel Macron.
149
recommendations, yes. And they were absolutely interesting. They were realistic. They were ambitious. So the Convention Citoyenne was asked to recommend how carbon reduction with 40% could be reached before 2030. And with these recommendations, that goal could be reached even earlier. So it was all very wonderful and interesting. But now,
there's a but.
A couple of months later, we see that a lot of those recommendations, so to say, get stuck in Parliament. So the people who are supposed to convert those recommendations into law, well, they're just, so to say, are cherry picking from those results what they will implement and what they will not. And that makes it, of course, very frustrating for the people who spend a lot of time and effort in formulating the recommendations. But it's also not good for the climate, because the recommendations were really designed to help fight climate change. So if you only pick some of those recommendations, it's not going to work. It's not going to be enough.
And why do they do that? Why does it get stuck in Parliament?
I think because there was not a very clear mandate. So there seemed to be one. President Macron had said, I will implement those, I will take over the recommendations unfiltered. And that would mean either they would be implemented immediately into law, or they would have to pass a parliament, or there would have to be a referendum. So that were the three options. But Macron did not quite have an agreement on this with Parliament. So I think Parliament kind of felt left out. So at the time of when those recommendations actually went to Parliament to be passed and to be transformed into law, I think the French Parliament thought, well, sorry, but this is not something we gave a mandate for. So that makes it very difficult. And that's what you see more and more often, that there is a wonderful process, there's a lot of time and energy put in those climate citizens assemblies. The recommendations are interesting, they are realistic, they are constructive, and could theoretically really help to solve the problem, but they don't get implemented because of a lack of political follow-up. So there's a lot of attention on the process, on how to select people, on how to make it a transparent process, on how to make sure that these recommendations are realistic, etc. But there isn't that much attention to the beginning, the mandate, what exactly is the mandate, and the end of the process, how do we make sure that those recommendations are actually being followed up politically.
Yeah.
So to make sure that climate citizens assemblies can actually have the impact that they potentially have, we really need to make sure that those recommendations are put into law and are being implemented the way they are intended, and not only a few of them, but really the package as a whole. So it should be very clear from the start what politics is intending, or what the politicians are intending to do with those recommendations.
So if we don't sort out the mandate and the political follow-up before starting a citizen assembly, it's in a way already doomed to fail?
well, it's not. I don't think it's doomed to fail, but I think you can prevent a lot of frustration and a lot of disappointment if you make that clear from the start. What will be done with those recommendations, and that I'm very interested in this evening because I'm very much looking forward to the examples, to the examples that we will hear about tonight, to hear how in practice people who organize citizens' assemblies,
how they deal with
it, what the arrangements are, how do you make sure that those recommendations can actually be implemented in the long run.
Okay, so this is the question of the evening, right? How can we make sure that it can be implemented in the long run? So we're here in the Netherlands, so we're staying local for the moment. Ellen Maas, like I said, you co-initiated the G1000 agriculture here in the Netherlands. That's quite a step. The Netherlands has experimented a bit already beforehand with citizen assemblies. Also on the local level, it's happening more. But you're organizing a national initiative. Yes. So tell us all about it. So what is it? The G1000 agriculture, and specifically, how does mandate and political follow-up? How are they organized within your initiative?
Yeah. Okay.
You have some slides.
I have some slides, yes, exactly. Great. So I will quickly tell about how it started, what it will look like, and where we're now. It started actually in 2019. I was at a demonstration, a climate demonstration of Extinction Rebellion, but simultaneously there were a lot of farmer protests going on because there were new environmental laws taking effect. And it seemed very much as though those groups were very much in opposition, right? But I felt like, but I understand the farmers as well. I understand that they have a problem in this situation. So why not bring these people together and let them decide how to go forward, and everybody in between. So if this is like the extremes of the spectrum. So I had heard about deliberative democracy, so I think that's a great solution. So I started looking for other people who were also enthusiastic about this, and I found a farmer who was enthusiastic, which is Mayella, and also the G1000, which is an organization that has in the Netherlands a lot of experience with organizing this at a local level and provincial level. And they were very enthusiastic, so we started doing that.
And you were the citizen in this.
I was the citizen, yes, exactly. In the role of a citizen, and what I find very interesting about the approach of the G1000 is that they start basically by getting support, and not just from government, from governance, but from society at large, so also from other organizations. So we also contact the Ministry of Agriculture, but also farmers' organizations, Extinction Rebellion, banks, nature conservation organizations, and all of them, we want support from them before we start, basically. And what they do is they sign, well, we hope many sign a partner agreement, which promises not to influence the process, but also to take the results seriously, which means publicly defending anything that will not be executed. And for the government, it means presenting it to Parliament as well. So that is the type of mandate that the G1000 is organizing. And this is a little bit more about the process. Right now, we have quite some support. So there's lots of organizations that are very enthusiastic. But we're basically still waiting for the political situation in the Netherlands to clear up a little bit, so that there will be a new Minister of Agriculture.
Yeah, because we're in the aftermath of national elections.
Exactly.
And we still don't have a new... Going on. Exactly. Yeah. So, you have to wait until we know more about the true coalition that is going to run the country for the next years.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Just a quick question, because so far citizen assemblies that we've discussed are around 100, 200 people. This is a G1000, so with 1,000 people.
1,000 people, exactly.
Why this number, and like how is it built up, this 1,000?
Yeah, so there is 625 citizens in there, and 125 politicians and civil servants, 125 landowners in this case, because it's about agriculture. So there's lots of farmers among the landowners, and also 125 people who free thinkers who assign themselves. Yeah, and I think it's in the Netherlands right now important to have politicians and civil servants be part of the process, so that they can also see and get to trust the process and see that citizens are doing a great job, which we hope they will, obviously. Yeah. But they shouldn't be drowned out. So they shouldn't drown out. They should be the minority still. So that's why you have a lot of people in the room. But the middle part of the process, which is the most intensive, is done with only 500 out of those 1,000. So,
but all groups are represented in those 500?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Eva, just a quick reaction. Is this, how do you look at an initiative like this when thinking about the state of the deliberative democracy here in the Netherlands?
Well, I of course think it's fascinating, and it's also a very interesting idea to involve a lot of different stakeholders. Mm-hmm. What I'm wondering is there anything asked from the politicians in the way that they have to promise that they will not only take the results seriously, but will that, for instance, be a promise that if a recommendation gets the support of, for instance, 80% of the members of the Citizens Assembly, that then they are kind of expected to put it into law? Is there anything like such?
Do you mean politicians in general, or the politicians participating?
Or the politicians that in the end will have to implement the recommendations. So either, I don't know if those are the politicians who are also part of the G1000, or perhaps that those are other politicians, but in the end, so it's of course about the people who actually have to switch from recommendation to lawmaking. So I'm interested in which
would be the government, basically.
Yeah. In this case,
and
the government,
Ministry of Agriculture. Yeah.
So
they will present it to Parliament.
Yes.
And Parliament still has to agree on it or not.
So
but there's no specific clause about something that is supported with a high percentage. No. But I think what is very important is that the society at large is watching, basically, right? So the process will be transparently visible in the media, and also all the other organizations are there. So as a politician, if there's so much support from society for an idea, it's probably a good idea to do something with it.
Yes, in my ideal world also. But
what if they don't?
What if they don't? What if they say, well, there is this reason or that reason, or I can think of a million reasons why they would say, well, of course, we'll discuss it in Parliament, but, well, we cannot.
That's certainly in danger. I agree. Yeah.
Let's discuss this when we have the group conversation. Let's see if we can come up with ways of how to make sure that some guarantees or some security is built in within the process. Because we have another practice that we're gonna hear from, and that is from Denmark, which is a bit of a different kind of story. Here in the Netherlands, Ellen, you really started to work from the ground up, finding coalitions between different grassroots organizations and others. But in Denmark, it was more of a top-down approach in which politicians were actually the one initiating the Climate Citizen Assembly, as I believe directly related to also the development of the Climate Act in Denmark. But I would love to hear more from this about this from Lars Kluver. Lars, welcome and nice to have you here. Can you briefly introduce us the Danish case, and then specifically also this issue of mandate and political follow-up, how that's being built in the practice there?
Yeah. I think the Danish case rests on a long tradition of having deliberative processes connected to the political debate, actually. We have had it since the end of the 80s. Citizen deliberative democracy coupled to policy advice in technology assessment and foresight. So there is a history in Denmark. And by having a history, it's a little bit less frightening for politicians, I think, to go along. What happened with the Climate Act was there was a large majority in Parliament that made an agreement about making a Climate Act, a law which on a yearly basis revisits the Danish climate politics and includes a climate council that looks upon the actions suggested by the government, see if they are enough to reach our targets, and else the government has to refine them. And that happens each year. When that agreement was made about making the Climate Act, this mechanism, political mechanism to have the ongoing, you could say, improvement of the action plans on climate. At that agreement, there was especially one party called the Alternative, but also some of the support parties for our social democratic government that pushed for having a citizen assembly connected to this. And it was decided. So in Danish democracy, that means that the government simply has to do it. So the Ministry of Climate began to work on this, and they put a procurement out for facilitators. My organization won that, so we were driving the citizen assembly. It was prolonged, delayed by COVID. So it was to start close to a year ago, but it ended up starting in October last year, and we had to go online, 100% online because of COVID-19. Say that we worked in, it's split in two phases. The first phase was from October to April this year. The second phase will be in autumn this year. Okay. And each of the phases ends up with recommendations. On April the 29th, there was a meeting in the Danish Parliament, a 2-hour meeting, online meeting, where the citizens presented their recommendations to the minister and to the Committee on Energy and Climate. It was, I think, 117 recommendations split into 9 different topics. And in each topic, there was, you could say, a motivation by the citizens. So what is the follow-up? We don't know yet, because it was the 29th of April, and there is a time lag in policy, always. We know that the government has, the Ministry of Climate has sent out the different recommendations to the ministries that would be affected by them, where the policies would be affected, to gather input. We know that this will be discussed in what is called the Green Committee across different ministers in the government. We also know that the parliamentary committee will make a statement or report, you could say, a short report about how they have discussed these recommendations. So basically you say the situation is that there is arm's length in the execution of the process, but the process as such is owned by the government after a decision in the parliament. Yeah. So it's a quite special construction, I would say. Yeah.
And was the mandate already positioned or defined before the process started? Because the political follow-up, of course, we still have to see because we're in the middle of it. But what about the mandate? How specified was that?
It was specified and very blurred.
Okay, elaborate, please.
It was simply called provide input and recommendations to the political process. So, and I think also we can discuss that later. Yeah. But in a way, I think that's quite wise. I mean, in my view, it's difficult for politicians. I think Macron is a very good example. He promised a lot and he couldn't keep it. And I think it's wise in a political domain to simply think that, okay, there's a representative democracy. In the end, it's those, unless we change our constitutions in Europe, it's them that has to decide in the end. They have been voted on by citizens to take those decisions. So in a way, citizens' assemblies, as they are installed now in our democracies, in my view, are advisory in a way.
Advisory. Okay.
Yeah.
We're gonna because I think several people would like to react, but we're gonna talk about that later.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So we've now heard from two different practices, and if we look at the mandate and the political follow-up, both of them are still searching a bit, and they are a bit more connected to indeed this advisory, or at least Parliament has to explain why it would, yes or no, take these recommendations and put them into practice, yes or no. But we're still a bit in the searching phase. Mm-hmm. And what we've done is that we've invited a speaker from the eastern part of Belgium, because that's quite a special case if you look at Europe, an inspirational model, you could say, in which citizen assemblies already are a structural part of the decision-making process. And we have invited Christophe Nice, who is a PhD candidate in political and social sciences, but he is also one of the so-called architects of this Eastern Belgian model of the Burgerraad. And we have asked Christophe to introduce us a little bit more elaborately on the way that Belgium has organized the citizen assembly model, so that we can afterwards reflect on the different tastes and the different flavors that we've heard so far. So Christophe, great that you're joining us. I understood you also have a slide that you would like to share. So please, I would like to give the word to you. Enlighten us about the Belgium model, please.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm going to enlighten you, but at least I can share a few experience from the Belgian case.
Yes.
That, in fact, is situated in a quite small area in Belgium, what we call the German-speaking community, which is, in fact, a federal substate entity in Belgium. So Belgium as a federal state has a national level of government that makes decisions, but also a sub-national levels with quite a bit of substantive power. And the German-speaking community is one of them. It's about 78,000 people living on roughly 850 square kilometers. So it's quite a small part of the country. But a few years ago, they followed different initiatives in the field of deliberative democracy and wanted to implement their own model that is connected more directly to the political system. And in fact, here we've also have a case of a top-down introduction by politicians who felt that they could benefit, in fact, from integrating citizens into their decision-making in order to get larger public support and go a bit against the democratic fatigue that even such small political places are experiencing as of today. And then they decided to ask different people in Belgium and beyond that had experience with deliberative democracy, how they could in fact introduce this in a more permanent way. And they call it the permanent citizen dialogue. And in order to give you a better understanding of what it is, I've indeed prepared a slide to share that I hope will appear with you in just a second. Yes. And if you want, in the German-speaking community in Belgium, you have already the traditional political institutions, which are a parliament of 25 members that is elected by any Belgian resident in the community aged 18, and which in turn elects and monitors a government of 4 ministers. Next to these traditional representative institutions, the permanent citizen dialogue constitutes an interaction of 3 different bodies: a body that we call the Citizen Council, a body that we call the Citizen Assemblies, and finally a body that we call the Permanent Secretariat. Before actually explaining what they do, I'll explain to you how they're composed, because that's going to be a bit more easy to follow, because as such the system is not not that easy to understand. It's a bit of complex, but it has good reasons for doing so that I can maybe explain a bit later. But the citizen assemblies are composed by random selection about all residents of the community, so independently of the nationality, and as of age 16, and more. Here, from the citizen assemblies, once they have taken place, there is another random selection that is made to compose the members of the Citizen Council, which is a 24-member body that is renewed every 6 months by a third, so that you have a mandate here of a year and a half if you're in it, and which in fact is the permanent institution of the model. The Citizen Council is there to select the topics that are debated by the citizen assemblies, to organize the citizen assembly, and to supervise and assist them in their task. And the citizen assemblies, in turn, are the ones that discuss the topic that is chosen by the Citizen Council. And the reason for having these two different bodies is that you want to separate powers, and you want that those who decide what the topic is are not those that are also going to debate them. And in turn, you want the composition to run the other way, because former members of the citizen assemblies have experience with it, know how it works, and can then in the Citizen Council, when they are selected, in fact, organize the citizen assemblies based on their past experience, and at the same time no longer interfere with the content because they're already out of the game, if you want. That's the idea here of this twofold logic and of these two different institutions, the one of which is permanent, the Citizen Council, and the others of which the citizen assemblies are more punctual, if you want. And once the citizen assemblies have discussed a topic, they issue recommendations of it to a public committee in which both the members of the citizen assemblies are sitting and the members of the parliamentary committee that is in charge of the topic. So if it's about education, it's the member of the education committee. It's about employment, it's the members of the committee in charge of employment. And in addition to this, you will have the minister in charge of the competence that also will join this public committee. And this committee seats 3 times. The first time is there for the citizen assembly actually to present their recommendation and to explain to politicians what they did, why they did it, and why they think these recommendations are good things for them to implement. After this, the politicians have a bit of time to reflect about this, and in the second meeting to explain how they are going to implement these different recommendations. And if they refuse to implement one, they have to make a separate justification and discuss it with the citizens. So you have either then a parliamentary follow-up that is made through legislative proposal in the parliament, or you have a more executive follow-up when it's something that the minister wants to do that can also later feed back into a legislative initiative. But these are the 2 ways, if you want, in which a decision or a recommendation of the citizen assembly can be taken up by the politician. And 1 year later, so 1 year after the second meeting has taken place, 1 year after they've discussed jointly, in fact, what is going to be implemented, there's a third meeting in which they explain to the citizens what has been put into place, what has not been put into place, and what is yet to come. And to make sure that this is not just, how should I say, or how Eva called it earlier, I think glorified public consultation, there's a mechanism for the Citizen Council to monitor this follow-up. So the Citizen Council can ask regularly during the year to be informed by the committee in charge, by the minister or by the ministry, to show him and tell him where the follow-up is actually standing at this point. And so you don't have a legal binding decision that is made here, but you have quite a few mechanisms and quite a bit of political commitment to actually implement here the recommendations that are made. And you also have this feature of a joint discussion between politicians and citizens on the content that I think is quite useful to gain mutual understanding for the good reasons that citizens have for making the recommendations, for the good reasons that politicians may have to implement in a certain way, or not. And this, if you want joint account, I think is something very valuable. Then we come to the last element of the model, if you want, the permanent secretariat, that is in charge of basically organizing all the process, making the random selection, providing the citizen assemblies with all the input or all the information they need. It is a sort of a super clerk to some extent, as you also have in a parliament. And to also control this kind of body, the Citizen Council is equally mandated to monitor the work that is done there and also to introduce another control in the model. Well, now you've seen all these arrows and functions and propositions turning around, and I hope it was not too quick at this stage, but if there are questions, I'm of course more than happy to answer. Yeah. And if I may, well, yes, briefly come back on the question of the mandate. The mandate here is not a legal one, and in the Belgian constitution, it's even quite debated if a process like a citizen assembly or even a referendum can, in theory, not be binding in Belgium, because the constitution foresees MPs to be only bound by their conscience and by nothing else. And so legally speaking, we're even on difficult terrain, which does not mean that the constitution cannot be changed, but it is an additional issue that also needs to be taken into consideration from a legal point of view. But I think that we have here still quite a strong political commitment. First of all, because it was a unanimous parliamentary decision to put this into place. It was supported by all different parties of the parliament. And I think that even, let's say, the informal pressure that you have as a politician to try to do something good with something that is so sophisticated and in which citizens spend so much time is not as easy. And I would take this as a quasi, not mandatory, but very important mandate that they've got.
Thank you, Christel. Thank you so much. Indeed, quite a complex overview, but thank you so much for your clear explanation. So one of the things that stuck most with me is maybe we don't need to focus that much on that we need a legal binding perspective or law, but we can look at mechanisms in which we can ensure that the political follow-up is more guaranteed or better integrated into the way of working. But well, that was one of the first things that resonated with me. I'm very curious to hear maybe some first responses from the other speakers, or maybe you have a question. And I'm just looking around. Maybe Lars also would like to share. Eva? Ellen? Who would like to start? Yes, Ellen?
Yeah, I have a question, but it's not specifically about mandate. So maybe if you prefer that, then you can start with a mandate question.
Well, now you're making us curious. So the evening is about the mandate and political follow-up, of course. Yeah. But please, if you can.
Yeah, I'm curious for these 24 people that set the topic, the council, right? Mm-hmm. Do they do that just among themselves, or do they get input from the society at large to determine what is the most pressing topic?
Should I respond?
Yes, please. Yeah.
They can have different sources of inspiration according to the decree that instituted all this model. They can make a public consultation, so have a public raising of suggestions, what they actually do via a website, in which every once a year they ask all the residents of the community to send topics and to vote on them. And so once a topic is sent in, it's listed on the website and people can vote on it and say, okay, this is the kind of things, priorities that we want to be taken up. In addition to this public consultation, every parliamentary group is also allowed to send in suggestions, just as is the government. And finally, 2 members of the Citizen Council can also table a suggestion that they would find important. And all these different sources of inspiration are equal. And so there is not something that obliges them to take the public idea with the most of the signatures. If they deliberate and if they consider one of the different ideas that they've heard to be the one that should be discussed, they can do it and they can select this one. And they can organize from 1 to 3 citizen assemblies a year. And so if they see, for example, there's a very large topic when it's going to take a lot of time, maybe we just do one of them. if they see that there are 2 that they would like to take up, they can take 2, or they can even go up until 3, even if they've not done this so far. But there's a bit of flexibility also in this respect for the Citizen Council to choose.
Yeah. Thank you, Christophe. Eva, if then coming back to this issue of mandate, political follow-up, you clearly stated at the beginning, tonight I am looking for ways what can help us implement the Citizen Assembly in a better way. Is this a model that, in your perspective, would help doing that?
I think it definitely could help. Yes, I think it's very interesting to see that there's a very equal balance of politics and people. So there is, it was of course organized or initiated top-down, which is also in this case very interesting because it means, if I understood correctly, that all political parties agreed to have this permanent Citizens Assembly, which of course is an ideal starting point.
Yes,
that's of course
we all hope
we all
for that.
would like to for that to happen, and of course in that case it makes it more realistic to expect that that this Citizens Assembly will be taken seriously, because there is this very broad consensus within all the political parties that this is something they want to implement into the system. And what I also thought was very interesting is also what you touched upon was the use of different kind of mechanisms. So not the process doesn't stop at the moment that the recommendations are delivered, but there are several meetings, several moments where the politicians and the citizens are going to discuss these, not just what is being implemented, what is not being implemented, but also a few months later, where are we now? Yes, so the monitoring also is, I think, is very important. So it's not something that just, well, you just drop your recommendations and you just hope that at some point politics will come back to it, but there's a very clear time path, if I understood correctly, and also very clear that there's a constant dialogue with the citizens on what is being done and why or why not. Yeah.
Lars, I'm curious, early on you mentioned that you look at citizen assemblies as more of an advisory kind of organization, and that you also think that that's the role that it should have. How did you listen to the story of Christophe? Is that something that maybe tickles you a bit to take one step further than advisory, or how did you take all this information in?
No, I think the German-Belgian case is inside my scope of what I would call advisory. The interesting thing about it is that it's very neatly laid out with regards to the functions and the mechanisms in which it is advisory. And I think that's very interesting. The whole process of having this little two-sided committee that discusses, and that committee ends up sending things to Parliament, to the government. They have to react back and they have to explain themselves. For me, that's still advisory. There's no, I mean, the politicians are not forced, to use that word, forced to decide what the citizens have recommended. They are forced to consider it, listen, react, respond on it. And then it's representative democracy and majority votes and all that takes over at some point. And so that is a very good example for me of well-constructed feedback mechanisms between the advisor and the political decision maker, which I think is fine. By the way, I just want to say, Christophe, that it's exactly the same in Denmark. We have in our constitution a sentence saying nothing above and nothing besides the parliament, which in itself just makes it very difficult to force the parliament to do anything. That's one thing. And we also have the sentence about that each politician should only live up to their own consciousness. Now, I'm not sure that they always do that, but we have that sentence. Yeah.
What I will get to you in a second, but what also interests me is that we've been talking about different ways of bringing citizens and politicians together. Ellen, in your example, the politicians, or selection of politicians, also take part in the Citizen Assembly. In this model from Christophe, they are partners, but they are not. They meet in the middle, right? In this public committee, there's the most direct exchange, but they are not part of the Citizen Assembly itself. In Denmark, the politicians are very closely related to the process, but it is a group of citizens. So I'm curious to see, like, what is what is the importance of putting politicians in the group, or not putting them in the group? What does that do? What does that
making
give us?
them part of the deliberative part of the process?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious because I would say, or I would think that it is a risk, because I think politicians are very eloquent. They know very well how to formulate certain arguments so that people are perhaps easily convinced. I think that can be, of course, is a quality, but it also can be difficult when you are deliberating as a regular citizen with a professional politician on a topic that perhaps you don't consider yourself an expert in.
Okay, so a little alarm bell.
I think it's difficult to have. But perhaps Christophe wants to say something about that. But I think that makes it difficult to have a really fair, equal discussion on the topics.
Ellen, maybe you first, because this is part of your proposal.
Yeah. So, well, the way that the G1000 agriculture is designed is, of course, from the experience of what G1000 has been doing for the past 7 years. And I think from their experience, these politicians and civil servants, they actually gain much more trust in the citizens by being part of the process, by seeing what the citizens are doing. And especially the last part where the election is happening, basically, of all the proposals, right? They're being voted for or against, feels similar to what politicians do. So it helps them trust the process, basically.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a little bit of an alarm, and we have somebody who sees potential in that. Let's see, Lars, what's your take on this role between politicians and citizens?
I mean, we just have to face that we can have a very, very long arm length, and then there's no dialogue and no impact. Or we can have it closer to politics and then there's much more impact. We have to be pragmatic here. And in my view, I have never seen, I've made hundreds of citizen engagement activities also with politicians. There's a deep respect both ways when they talk together. That's my experience. And I mean, the politicians really respect these citizens. They have considered things. They have the word in their mouth. They argue well for their case. So I think just as politicians should trust in citizens, I think the rest of us should also trust in the citizens, that they can actually they can argue for their case. They do it quite well.
Yeah. And can I ask, just for my clarification, are the politicians part of the deliberative process in Denmark as well? No. Okay, just to have that.
They were not, but they could have been called in as experts, witnesses, or whatever you call it.
Yeah.
Christophe, what is your take on this?
Well, I think there are two good reasons to put citizens and politicians together. The first of which is more legitimacy reason, meaning that both have very different legitimacies. The first of one is an electoral legitimacy, that they have been voted for and represent, if you want, the relative share of opinions across society. And at the same time, they have very often a very poor descriptive representativeness. And so you have a lot of highly educated, a lot of people that come from upper classes, and not many people from the much larger share of lower classes. And so the Citizen Assembly has a much more descriptive representativeness. And bringing these two groups together gives you the best of two worlds to some extent, I would argue.
Yeah.
But then there comes the problem that Eva points out, and which is that politicians might just take over the lead. And I think I see two remedies for this. If we look, for example, at the Irish example, where they have a mixed setting of citizens and politicians discussing together.
Yeah, in the earlier years.
A larger number of politicians, just of citizens, just as I understand with the G1000 agriculture. So the let's say numerical asymmetry is the first thing that one can think of, but there's a second one, namely when we look at the Belgian example here, you first have a sitting or a reunion between the citizens themselves. They get knowledge about the topic, they inform themselves, they discuss, and they get empowered, if you want, before they go together with the politicians. This is a whole process, and I think feminist theories and feminist practice very often work with safe spaces, for example, to first empower a group before it goes somewhere else. And this is a bit in the same strain, I would say, of light. And so this is another potential remedy that one could think of to then fully grasp the potential of a joint and a mixed setting that has many benefits, in my opinion.
Great. Yes, a reaction maybe first from Ellen and then Lars?
Yeah, just to be clear, in the G1000 agriculture, the politicians are 1/8 of the total. Yeah. So it's not, it's not half or something like that.
And is there first a meeting with the citizens only, like Christophe suggested?
No, but the process in the beginning is very much in such a way that it encourages dialogue and everyone to have the same amount of speaking time, basically, in smaller groups.
So you control the process in that way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Lars?
I just want to say that I think we also need to understand that from the citizens having deliberated among themselves, developed recommendations, arguments, and so on, and to the politicians understanding those, it's so that they are able to act on them. That's quite a bit of work. I mean, one thing is to write a 3-line recommendation or maybe some argumentations behind it and to deliver it as a report and to read it up for the politicians. Another thing is to sit and discuss it with the politicians so that the politicians actually understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I think we should make more situations connected to deliberative democracy where the citizens actually get time with the politicians so that the politicians feel with and understand the citizens in what they want to say. And it just cannot be done with a list of 149 recommendations delivered on paper. There needs to be a dialogue. And then we have to be a little methodologically pragmatic in order to secure that the citizens actually get their messages through.
And which would be a good way to do that?
I think Christophe's way is very good. There are others. I mean, in Denmark we also have what we call mixed committees, especially in the municipalities. So it's specialized committees where citizens are invited in to discuss with the politicians so that they understand each other. In some of these, there are some different deliberative processes coupled to them. In too few, I would say. But there are many tips and tricks you can use in order to have a good dialogue between the citizen group and the politicians. I think that's necessary. Else, no action will happen.
Yeah. So what I'm actually hearing is that maybe the most important reason for bringing the two worlds together, right? So you're talking about creating trust, both in citizens, but also understanding the world of politicians, understanding each other's language, respecting the work that both parties are doing, and working on the legitimacy, creating a higher form of legitimacy in a way by combining both the electoral form and the descriptive representation of the citizen assembly. I think that gives us a good building block, right? This is something that we can work with that makes a positive contribution. But if we look at or sort of fantasize about what our most ideal way of integrating such a citizen assembly would be. What is still missing? What do you miss when looking at this conversation? Is there still something that's not enough?
Well, what I'm wondering is how you mix it, especially when it comes to climate, because this is really a very complex, very multifaceted subject, which is not something you can address with just a few measures, even not 149 measures. Yeah. You really need an integral strategy to combat it. And what I'm wondering is, how do you make sure, I think citizens' assemblies are very well equipped to formulate such a strategy, but how do you make sure with the various forms we have discussed this evening, that the politicians will not cherry pick, so that they will. How do you prevent a package of recommendations to be smashed down and taken apart into these independent measures that in itself may not be very effective. So how do you make sure that the recommendations are as a whole are respected? Because just to theorize about the process in Denmark, politics is now writing up a report. It could be that they really respect the recommendations and they consider them as a whole, and they will use this whole of recommendations to develop their policy. But also there is, of course, a possibility that they will just take some of those measures, or will say, well, thank you very much, very interesting, and now we'll go our own way and do whatever we want to do. So how do you make sure that the strategy, especially when it comes to climate policy, is respected, and that there is no cherry picking, which will make it ineffective?
Christophe, maybe coming back to you, because you have this beautiful scheme, right? You have all the arrows and all the mechanisms in place. Do you see mechanisms that could help in this specific issue that Eva is putting on the table?
I was thinking while she was talking, and obviously in the German-speaking case, you will not find something as mandatory that would allow something to enforce. But I would say I would try to trust in the force of the best arguments of citizens convincing the politicians there to do it. And if this doesn't do the job, or if you can't protect it with this, obviously you would have to go for some rules like if 80% of the citizens support it, politicians have to take it over. But I don't have experience with this, and I don't know how the two bodies will react at some point. I know that there are a few examples in Poland, for example.
Yes.
Where on the municipal level, they had a similar setting of citizens deliberating, presenting it to the mayor, and the mayor said at the outset, if 80% of you support it, I will do it, whatever it is. And again, it was not legally binding. It was a commitment by the mayor.
No, we've had Martin Gerwin in the first event explaining that as well. Yeah, there was a legal threshold in place. Lars, maybe you would like to add?
No, I think there's a difference between those citizen assemblies which has a yes-no problem. For example, the abortion question in Ireland. It's much easier politically to say we will listen in this and this way. But when we have such a complex issue as climate change over a long time, extremely complex, I don't think the Danish Citizen Assembly, I will ask them next time I meet them, if they think that what they made is a strategy, a coherent strategy. I don't think they would say that they made a coherent strategy. I think they said that they suggested some actions that they think should be well considered by politicians. But I will ask them next time, because I think there is difference between making a coherent strategy and then cherry picking in it, or making suggestions for different elements that could be used and then cherry picking in it. Yeah, I think it's much more acceptable in the last case. I don't think there are any citizen assemblies yet. I mean, they meet 5 to 6 weekends. I don't think any experts in climate change would say that in 5 to 6 weekends could make a coherent strategy for climate change. So I don't think any of them would say they have a coherent strategy.
Yeah. So they don't share the same worry. But what did this help? Are you comforted that it will be okay, or
no? I think this is something we really have to be very much aware of, and I do think that, of course, I agree that that the 149 measures in France were not a completely coherent strategy, but there were 5 main topics. They were integrated. There were a lot of calculations pointing out to the fact that if those measures were all be in place, that the goal would be reached. So I think that is some kind of strategy, and I think it would be, and it loses a lot of impact. The moment that you say, well, we'll just take measure number 20 and measure number 52, for instance. So so I don't quite agree, and I really think a lot of those climate citizens assemblies can only reach their full potential if people are allowed to think in this way, to trust the fact that whatever they recommend, that it will be seen as a whole and as a coherent plan that you should consider as a coherent whole, and not just pick and choose from.
Yeah. I'm thinking, like, is it, in your perspective then, Eva, is it or they have to it's one or another, or they have to go fully for it, the politicians, taking up the recommendations as a whole, or they should say, oh, sorry, no, this package we cannot implement?
No, I don't think it's that easy, but I do think that it could be made clear beforehand under what circumstances politicians are able to say, I'm sorry, we cannot implement those recommendations. So it should be, the starting point should be, in principle, we would like to take over all the recommendations with, for instance, more than 80% consensus. But if there are very clear disadvantages or problems with it, then sorry, then we don't. But it should be very clear from the start.
Yeah. So you want to change the default phase of it. Ellen, what is your take on this?
Well, I think that...
let me phrase it like this. Are you worried that there will be cherry picking when you start a national initiative here in the Netherlands, and that it will sort of degrade the process in that way?
I certainly think it's a risk that we have to think about. But I think that the agreement that the government signs does have that property that the default is we will execute everything. And if there are some parts that we don't, we'll have to defend very well why not to do it. But I don't think it's feasible to ask them to just say no. It's binding, right? We cannot ask that. Yeah.
Well.
Yeah,
we can try.
That's a different conversation.
No, that's
we already have to round up. Okay. No, please finish your sentence.
No,
please
I was curious. I wanted to ask Lars a question, but that will maybe take too much time.
Well, let's save it for later, because unfortunately our time, it's just time flies, and it's an issue that is complex and multi-layered. But I think we did touch upon a couple of perspectives that could maybe help us make a step forward, and thinking about which type of elements do we really need to pay attention to when we think about the mandate and the political follow-up of the outcomes of a citizen assembly. So I want to thank you all so much for joining us, the speakers here in the studio, but also, of course, the speakers online and the audience that has been with us. If you feel upset right now that we have to stop the the live cast and you want to share your thoughts or you want to ask more questions, you can always send an email. You can send it to me. You can also look on our online platform where you can read more articles, interviews. Also a new article that's an interview with this Polish key player that we mentioned earlier on the practices that are taking place in Poland. Marcin Gerwin. So have a look at that. And then on June 23rd at 6:30 local time, we will be back with the next livecast. So also keep an eye on the agenda of Pakhuis de Zwijger. And we hope to see you again then for the next conversation. Thank you so much. Have a great evening. And until then, bye-bye.